Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker, Professor Tim Benton, is a professor of population ecology, head of department for the School of Biology at the University of Leeds, as well as a global food security champion. Without further delay, I now invite Professor Tim Benton on stage to present his keynote speech entitled, "The Challenge of Food Security in 2050, Can We Do It Sustainably?"
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, distinguished visitors. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you today about the future of food security over the next 40 or 50 years up to mid-century. So this is very much a look ahead into the long term rather than just a position where we are now. And I want to especially talk about some of the competing drivers that are going to face us both societally and from a RSPO, palm oil perspective in terms of production of food, climate change and those sorts of things. So let's just start off with where we are today. Food is the world's biggest industry. It is also the world's largest land user. It's the world's largest water user. It's the world's largest polluter, which undermines essential environmental systems. Arguably, it contributes to more ill health than any other factor. We need food daily, or perhaps if you're like my wife, 15 or 16 times a day. But increasingly, there isn't enough food in the world. And in future, we have to cope with less land, probably, rather than more land. We have to cope with less water rather than more water. We certainly have to do something about reducing the environmental impacts. And we have to reduce the ill health factor that comes from overeating food. And we have to increase global food production. So where are we looking into the future? Into the future, by the middle of the century, there'll be about 35% more people on the planet. Those people are getting richer, although it doesn't always feel like it. And richer people want to eat more and eat different food. That itself produces a radical increase in the amount of food required. The population of the world is also getting increasingly urbanized, and urban populations tend to be time poor, relatively income rich. There is a break between where food comes from and the respect for food, and food becomes a commodity that is easily wastable. We have very little time, we buy food, we put it in the fridge, we find it a little bit later, we throw it away when it goes a bit slimy. And so urban populations tend to be more wasteful of food. And when you put these three factors together, that leads to an increase projected of demand of about 60%. It might be more, it might be less. But if you take a line through where food is going and project it forward, we will perhaps need 60% more food on the planet by the middle of the century. The man at the bottom is Jason Clay from World Wildlife Fund in Washington, and he's made a back-of-the-envelope calculation that suggests that if the demand for food carries on rising, by 2050, so in 37 years' time, the world will need to produce more food over the next 37 years than it has ever produced before in human history. That gives an outline of the scale of the problem. So, on to food security. What is food security? Food security occurs when everybody has access to food that is of the right sort. So, affordable, accessible, nutritious, and so on. And implicit in the definition of food security is also the fact that it is sustainably produced. Because if it is unsustainably produced, we might gain food security now, and in future, that leads to food insecurity because the systems that produce the food might collapse. So food security has to include sustainability. And many people think about food security as being something to do with the poorest in society. And obviously, with about 1 billion people in the world who are hungry, that is really important. But increasingly, it is seen to be important whichever country in the world that you live in. And the reason that food security is becoming increasingly important across all societies is that the competition for land, competition for water, the complexity of food prices and how they then translate the way through society leads to the potential for a vast degree of civil unrest, international conflicts, and so on. This quote on the board here, it is well for us to remember that the only barrier between us and anarchy is the last 9 meals that we have had. Comes from 1896, and it was an American commentator, and that applies in whatever society you're in. If food prices go up, people get deprived, the basics of human hunger become really important, and people then, that leads to the breakdown of civil obedience and all sorts of other things. The picture on the slide is the National Intelligence Committees of the United States Global Trends 2025 that suggests by 2025 competition for resources, including food and the land for food, will be the biggest driver of international unrest around the world. And clearly, this is true whatever society you're in. Rising food prices led to the French Revolution, when the cost of daily bread rose to about 80% of a working man's salary. That was enough to get people on the street and led to the breakdown of civil order. And there is a lot of evidence around the world now that the food price spikes of 2007, 2008 and 2011 led to civil unrest. This graph here shows the FAO food price index, and where there is a red vertical line, there was a degree of civil unrest that happened in the countries. And as you can see, the clumping of the red lines and the high food prices is quite a indicative correlation that rising food prices lead to rising civil unrest. And it was one of the contributory factors, therefore, in the breakdown of the kick-off of the Arab Spring back a couple of years ago. And then we have the issue of, around the world, clearly, different people eat different amounts of food and have different access to different resources. And if you look ahead into the future, as suggested by this quote from the WWF Living Planet Index, if everybody in the world aspires to eat like a Northern European or an American, will there be enough global resources available to feed us all? If everybody ate like an American, we would require, according to this analysis, 3 to 4 Earths to supply the food. Is that possible as a global aspiration? Even if it is possible, it is almost certainly not sustainable. And then when you look, this is a fantastic book that the photographs are available on the web, where a photographer went around the world and took photographs of families with their week's food supply. And here are just 2 from both ends of the spectrum, the richest and the poorest. If you look at where people have access to food, clearly it's unequal. And one of the issues now is that we live in a very globalized world, and where there is such difference in the ability to get access food, that is known, and the poorest people in society around the world know that their life is worse. And maybe 100 years ago, that amount of knowledge of the inequity was not there. So what that also increasingly means is that if people feel that they are disempowered, if they feel they don't have access to resources, and increasingly as we look ahead over the next decades, that will lead to the poorest wanting to move. And this photograph from a couple of weeks ago were migrants travelling across the Sahara whose car broke down and then they all died. But the driver for the movement was the economic migration to go to a better place. So if the world is full of the rich and the poor no longer know, the poor now know that they are poor, and they now know that they can go to places where they can be rich. And so the patterns of social migration driven by changes in food supply are likely to increase over the next decades. So the world wants more food. Can we supply that food? Well, increasingly there is competition for natural capital, the amount of land and water required. And as you can see from this map, where there are colours, effectively the land is being used for agriculture. The areas where there are not colours are hot deserts, cold deserts, and rainforest. We're running out of land to grow more food if we will require more food. And one of the issues that's really important, and it was shown by a variety of reports over recent years, is that given climate change, the most efficient way of creating climate change is to chop down rainforests and convert it into agricultural land. So we have to, globally, reduce deforestation, because otherwise, and I'll come back to this in a minute, otherwise it comes back to bite us in future generations. Well, not even future generations, future decades. We're starting to feel the impacts of climate change now. So we have a trade-off over time between short-term gains in terms of producing more food and the economics of it versus long-term costs. And one of the dangers is we lose sight of that. We can make short-term economic gains by chopping down rainforests, but the long-term cost is probably indescribable in terms of human suffering. As well as having increasing competition for land, there are a whole range of other resource constraints that stop us intensifying agriculture in the way that we could do to produce extra food. The issue of pollution from nitrogen and phosphates from fertilisers is huge. A recent report in the European Union showed that the costs of using nitrogen exceeded the economic benefits in terms of growing the yield. And those costs occurred through air quality and affecting human health, through terrestrial biodiversity impacts, through aquatic biodiversity impacts flowing out to the sea and impacting on marine fisheries. So the issue of nitrogen and phosphate pollution and pollution of water that other people might want to use for other purposes is increasingly acting as a brake against intensification of agriculture. Pesticides and the use of pesticides increasingly is also being seen to be a bad thing for agriculture as consumers, and I'll come back to consumers in a little while, as consumers react against having pesticides in the production of food. The issue of global soil resources is also important. Around the world, about 12 million hectares of soil are abandoned each year because they have been degraded. And that, of course, means that to be sustainable, we have to invest in soil resources because there is no more land. Once we've abandoned one bit, we can't access extra land. So the issue of changing climates, I want to talk about this for a couple of minutes in some detail because I think it is going to be a really significant driver over the next decades. The blue distribution, and this is a graph for France, but it could be almost anywhere, the blue distribution is the temperatures recorded, averaged around zero for effectively the last century, is a distribution of projected climate towards the end of the century for the sorts of emissions that we're currently producing into the atmosphere. Two things to note from that. 2003 will be slightly cooler than average by the end of the century, unless we do something. But the thing that for me is more frightening is that because the weather is variable, a hot year towards the end of the century could be 7, 8, or even 9 degrees above average. And for France, a nice temperate northern country, that would give it the same climatic regime as Libya, North Africa. And imagine the sorts of disruptions to agriculture that that would lead to. This is a map which shows, towards the end of the century, with the same projection, that where it is red, every year is going to be hotter than any year ever recorded. Every year, hotter than any year ever recorded, unless we do something about climate change. And of course, that's going to impact upon yields. Here is a map from a recent science paper which shows where agricultural yields are going to go down. The deep red is minus 50% on where we are now. Greens are positive, reds are negative. Can you press the button, please? Thanks. This is a map of where calories are produced in the world. And superimposing the two on top of each other, there are only 5 places really where the bulk of the world's calories are produced. And looking on the map of climate change impacts, most of those are going to be heavily impacted by climate change. And so yields are not going to be able to expand. They're going to be impacted over the next decades, which of course produces a challenge for food security. So that's a projection into the future. I want to show you data now. These are heat maps of the world. And in these heat maps, the colour code is the area that is covered by heats of different levels. So where it's hot, it's reds and browns, and where it's colder, it's blues and purples. And roughly speaking, under historic climatic regimes, you'd expect about 2% of the land area to be red and about 0.1% of the land area to be brown. So these maps are for 1955, 1965, 1975. And then these are the maps for the last 6 or 7 years. We are up to a situation where what, when I was born, would have been a 1 in 750-year event is now a 1 in 7 to 1 in 10-year event. This is climate change happening now, extreme heat. One of the very simple predictions of climate change is that severe storms will get worse. And that's exemplified this week, that the strongest storm ever has come through this part of the world. How will the economies of this part of the world cope if a storm like that is likely to pass over your heads every 2 or 3 years? It is undescribable to think what that means for people and for the natural environment. Next, please. I now want to talk a bit about sustainability, because as a sustainability scientist, this is really close to my heart. And one of the issues about being sustainable is that it typically reduces production, so it comes with an economic cost. And therein lies part of the nub of the issue, an economic cost. When do we get the payback? And my thesis over the next section is effectively the payback comes in terms of sustainability over time, as opposed to immediate impact on competitiveness now. So, what does sustainability mean? Next, please. Sustainability, according to the Brundtland definition, is the ability to endure into the long term. That is the ability to endure into future generations. Now, a child born today in Europe is likely to live to 100, almost certainly. Life expectancy of a girl born today is about 45% likelihood of getting to 100. So a single generation from today takes us into 2110, 2113, 2115. Those projections of climate change I was talking about are not generations into the future, they are a single lifetime. And that is the scary thing. If we are currently on course for a 4-degree world, which we are, and if we're on course for, in a 4-degree world, the variability getting greater and it being very, very hot, in a hot year it might be 6, 8, 10 degrees hotter, the costs of that are going to be incalculable. And I would say, with my knowledge of this area, that any forest clearance for large-scale plantation agriculture is, in the long run, going to be unsustainable because of its direct impacts on the global carbon budget. It's a one-way transition. Once we chop down the rainforest and liberate all that carbon, it's gone, the biodiversity's gone. It cannot be seen to be sustainable. And one of the things about the world, as we're starting to recognize it in sustainability science, is that there are many things that we value that come from the land. Food, fuel, fibre, a whole range of things like that, which is obviously what is economically exploited, but a whole range of other goods that we value. And all of these goods are underpinned by ecosystem processes and ecology in some way, shape or form. And the reason there's a cloud up there is that some of my colleagues at the University of Leeds have recently shown for West Africa that fragments of rainforest that have been left, they provide food, fuel, fibre, forage, pollination services, so the bees come out of the forest and pollinate crops so that people can grow fruit and vegetables. But by changing the colour of the land and by transpiring so that the trees are sweating effectively, molecules go up into the atmosphere and those molecules create the clouds, they're cloud condensation nuclei. And those clouds create the rainfall. So if you chop down the rainforest, not only do you lose the food, fuel, fibre, forage, pollination, biodiversity, all the other stuff, you also lose the rainfall, which then impacts on your local agricultural practice. So the sustainability of the system as a whole requires thinking about things in terms of their biological, ecological function. Sustainability is not something that is a corporate social responsibility factor. Sustainability has got to underlie core business responsibility, core business principles, because if you're not sustainable, if you convert all of the land to away from forestry, you lose all the business. You have to think more about sustainability being important. And we know that natural capital, the value of the soil, the value of the biodiversity, the value of the rainfall, natural capital subsidizes production economies. We know that. But for so many systems, that natural capital is completely unaccounted. We don't look at an annual balance statement. All we do is we take from the land in the hope that we can carry on doing that into the future. But we don't know when the Bank of Natural Capital is going to become overdrawn. We don't know the consequences of it, other than ecologists like myself can say, things will be dire. We don't know when it will be, and therefore that undermines the long-term sustainability. We have to start getting our heads around the true cost of production in terms of requiring us to maintain the natural capital. Unless we maintain the natural capital, then sustainability into the long-term future cannot be guaranteed. And sustainability has so many different impacts, so many different things that we need to consider. This is just some work we're doing in my lab at the moment. All of the metrics around the centre, we have yield, welfare, profit, energy use, biodiversity, water use, nutrient use, greenhouse gases, pollination services, pest control, soil, hydrology. All of those things are part of what you have to manage to be sustainable. Sustainability is not just about greenhouse gases, not just about any single one of these different aspects. We have to manage them all, because otherwise the long-term consequences are dire. And when it comes to palm, there is a very interesting meta-analysis recently published, 2012, by Josef Manik's group. And this is just quite a useful source for some of the environmental impacts. This is for biofuel, but I think the principle stays the same. This table illustrates the carbon payback time of creating a plantation. And clearly, the carbon payback time depends very much on where your plantation is, but it varies from 10 years if you plant on degraded land to up to 900 years if you plant on peatland forest. Now, one of the things that's coming out of the latest IPCC is that we have a time to act for climate change over the next decade or so. If we don't start acting now, the costs of acting in the future are going to get out of control. We are already passing the 2-degree barrier. We've lost that battle. We have to face 2 degrees of climate change, almost certainly. The issue is, can we stay at about 2 degrees, or are we going to go into the uncharted territories of 3 or 4 degrees? We have to act now. And I would say that creating new plantations and land use change that have payback times of hundreds of years is so counterproductive for our local economic, for the economic sustainability of this region or any part of the world, that it becomes counterproductive. So sustainability around carbon, but also sustainability around many other things. The table at the top is the eutrophication potential, significant water quality issues from nitrogen fertilizer and phosphate fertilizer use, and clearly biodiversity. An average oil palm plantation has about 400 species per 0.1 of a hectare than forest. So clearly there are environmental impacts, as we all know. Sustainable production needs us to think about what's going on in the planted area. We need to manage the soils, we need to manage fertilizer use, we need to manage pesticides, we need to manage all sorts of other things. But equally, sustainable production requires us to manage areas of non-cropped land, because that is where the bulk of ecosystem services are produced from. So that requires landscape planning because of the dependence of ecosystem services on non-crop land. So one of the issues around sustainability of agriculture in general is that you can look at what's going on in a field or a plot, and that looks good because you're doing all you can. But when you scale that up to a very large scale, the very large scale becomes unsustainable unless you set aside land all the way through to make sure the ecosystem services are produced. So sustainable agriculture is not just about the small scale. Sustainability has got to be about the large scale landscape level considerations. So that concept in itself leads to a whole lot of thinking about space. And clearly, when you're thinking about space, it also leads to thinking about governance and sovereignty. So different areas of the world and different areas of any country have different capabilities. And they have different levels of the natural capital. Some areas have truly high potential production, and some areas have truly high biodiversity and other things. And some of the biodiversity has a World Heritage status. And that leads to the notion, if it's the World Heritage status, does that belong to everybody in the world, or does that belong to only the people who inhabit that place? The concept of World Heritage status when it comes to landscapes and buildings is that they should be protected for the benefit of everybody. So we have to be very careful about where we drive production and where we conserve things for the global good or the local good. So the spatial aspects are important. And we're increasingly realize that actions have consequences everywhere. So deforestation, because it increases the carbon budget in the atmosphere, harms everybody. But who does it benefit? Does it benefit a lot of people? Does it really create a local economic good? Or does it create an economic good that's in the pockets of a relatively small number of people? How good is it for the local people, and how willing are they to engage in this? We need to have smarter land use around the world, not just in palm, but in every area. Smarter land use to make sure that those areas that do have high production potential are used to their best ability, and those areas that need extra conservation because they have something of important global heritage are conserved. And that leads to thinking about issues such as land sparing versus land sharing. And my own personal view is that we need land sparing, so some areas need to be strongly protected, but we also need land sharing in that in some areas the best use of that land will be in a softer agriculture with lots of, in this part of the world, lots of natural forest interdigitated to make sure that the local ecosystem services are preserved and the local social services are preserved. And we have to think about spatial scales. If we're looking at the globe, it makes sense to drive agriculture hard in some parts of the world and drive it less hard in other parts of the world. But that runs counter to the economic growth opportunities for those parts of the world where it doesn't make sense to drive it hard. So how do the rich parts of the world compensate the less rich parts of the world to preserve some of their ecosystem services? And then the issues around governance. There is always, in every legal situation, in every nation state, there is always some set of statutes about doing things for the public good. So in the UK, there is a lot of discussion at the moment about putting in a new high-speed train line. And the government will be able to say, we want that high-speed train line, it's in the national good, we've got to buy your land off you. And every nation is allowed to do that. So what is genuinely good for a nation can involve local peoples being disadvantaged, if it is for the greater good. But we've got to make sure and hold our decision makers responsible for the fact that it is for the greater good. We cannot, if we try and not produce more food around the world, lots of people will be harmed, economies will be harmed, but we've got to make the decisions about how we produce more food and how we preserve the natural capital in a way that is in the greatest good, I think, for the greatest number of people. And most importantly, I think, we have to make sure that the good that occurs to the right peoples, the right publics, and over the right timescales. There is no sense in having a local economic good now if in 20 years' time or 30 years' time or 40 years' time that creates such a big cost that the economy is crippled. And I think there is a real danger of that where there is food production being driven in the name of food security, that the short-term benefits that we gain by increasing food production end up with a long-term harm. One of the issues around the impacts on society of intensification of agriculture is often the impacts on local societies. And I just want to flag up, it is perfectly possible to audit these sorts of things. And here is a paper, again, from Malik's group, which just has looked at full groups of stakeholders and effectively done some survey questionnaire work and come up with a view about whether or not the different groups of stakeholders feel as though their actions are being taken into account. So over the last few minutes or so, I just want to talk about the future. Food security is not just about producing more food, and this is one of the increasing arguments that's being made around the world. Just as a couple of stats, Europe and North America throw away each year about the whole of production from sub-Saharan Africa. That's scary. About between 30 and 40% of global food is wasted or lost at some point in the food chain. If we manage that better, that reduces some of the land pressure, which allows us to gain sustainability. And then around the world, and this I think is going to be a very big driver of requirements for food in the future, there are as many people in the top category, the obese and overweight, as there are in the malnourished and seriously malnourished categories. And it's getting to the point where actually every country in the world is having an obesity epidemic which is creating public health issues. It's just the degree to which you have overnourished and undernourished people in the same country varies, of course, with income. And so I think one of the drivers for the future is going to be changing our global food model. At the moment, we're in a situation where we're moving towards unsustainable production, supplies cheap food, which we waste, we overconsume, which has a strong environmental impact, and we get used to that, so we increase demand even more. And I'm calling this the M25 model because in the UK we have this orbital motorway that goes around London, and that started as a 3-lane motorway, and as soon as it opened, it got jammed. So they put another lane on, and that got jammed, and another lane on, and that got jammed. We're now up to 6 lanes, and it's always jammed. I think no matter how much food in the world we produce, if we carry on with this existing food model, it will never be enough. And then we will always face that taking more and more and more and more from the environment. And on the green, I don't think you can read it, at the bottom it says, if everybody in the US ate 1 less burger a week, no, everybody in the US ate no meat or dairy 1 day a week, over a year that would be like not driving 91 billion miles. 91 billion miles if people in the States didn't eat meat and dairy 1 day a week. And the paper by Pete Smith's group show actually there is a 4 times greater greenhouse gas mitigation aspect of changing the demand for food than there is in changing everything about food production into a climate-friendly way. 4 times greater. So if everybody in the world ate a nutritious diet, according to dietary recommendations, it would save all of the issues to do with climate-smart agriculture having to happen, because it would save actually more in climate terms. So there is a thought process that's going on about let's make production sustainable, let's pay the full cost of food rather than the partial cost of food, including the environmental costs, and let's waste less, consume less, eat sensibly, and manage demand. and that is the overall notion of sustainable nutrition. Not sustainable agriculture, which is let's produce more and more and more and more and try and make it sustainable, but let's make demand sustainable so that we don't have to pressure the environment as hard as we're currently doing. So finally, a bit about palm. So I want to ask the question, how much does palm contribute to food security? Now, clearly palm is hugely important in terms of it is a cheap vegetable oil that is required by many people around the world. And palm is never going to go away. It is always going to be useful. But this recent paper out of Tim Lang's group in London effectively makes this argument. Agricultural policy stimulates the production of palm oil or other goods. That increases the production, which reduces the prices. Within the food chain, it leads to a substitution from one form of fat to another form of fat, or it causes an enrichment in fat. That, coupled with a reduction in prices, leads to public health impacts. And this study, published a couple of months ago, is really, really frightening, I think, from a global perspective. So this is the first in-depth study of diabetes in China, and they found that 11% of the adult population was diabetic, and 50% of the adult population was pre-diabetic, so showed signs of diabetes. So that is thinking into the future over the next 10 years or so. If some of the pre-diabetics become diabetics, there might be 300 million diabetic people in China. In the UK, the healthcare cost of a single diabetic is about £1,000 a year. So that is 300 billion, the healthcare costs of obesity and overconsumption. So I think the issue of demand is going to come back and modify the future of palm oil, because having access to ever greater amounts of cheap fat, which is what palm oil effectively is going to lead to such public health costs that governments are going to really drive this issue to do with proper standards of nutrition. So I don't think the palm oil sector is going to grow indefinitely. I don't think it's ever going to go away. I don't think it's going to grow indefinitely. And so what you produce now, I think you ought to really put a badge on and try and do it in a way that is sustainable as possible. And so we have an issue about the legacy of palm. There is growing consumer-driven demand for both healthy food and for sustainability. And the UK government statement on sustainable palm oil, 2012, pushed the sustainability, that all of our palm oil should be certified. But there is also growing distrust and cynicism about the claims made throughout the food chain. And in the UK, that was driven by our Horsegate saga earlier in the year, where horse was found to be in beef burgers, and it had just been contaminated. But the whole issue of consumer faith in claims is becoming much more difficult and is driving a whole range of different issues. So we need, if we are going to badge something as sustainable, we need to make that as trustworthy as possible. So what does sustainability mean? Does it mean the same thing to somebody who's buying it as it means to me or it means to you? And the answer is no. But different people will have different notions. And for some it will be orangutans, for others it will be carbon, for others it will be livelihoods. And that's why, Minister, it does become important that all of these things are under the badge of sustainability. So can we make the brand trustworthy? Can we make it verifiable that somebody on the outside comes in and says, show me the evidence? Don't show me a tick list of what you're doing. Show me the evidence that it's making a difference. Does it lead to a positive change? How are you auditing the outcomes of what you're doing, as opposed to saying, we are doing something? We are doing something is no longer good enough for consumers. It is, what has your doing something led to, that becomes important. There is huge opportunity for a positive legacy. If the demand for palm is going to go down, the demand for sustainable palm is going to increase. You can really drive, through RSPO, the trustworthiness of the palm oil sector. Equally, you could you could fail in that endeavour and palm oil be seen as unsustainable. And then what's the legacy? Certainly in the UK, some of the CEOs of the big food companies are worried that in 20 years' time they will be sued by people who are suffering in ill health, much as the tobacco giants are being sued by people who have smoked for years and have ended up with ill health. What is the legacy? Do you want to be seen as the good guys, clearly you do, or the bad guys in 20 years' time, even if now you're making a profit? So I think RSPO needs to push the bar higher each year, year on year. And I know that's going to be unpopular amongst some people, but the demand side issues, the climate change issues, the need of consumers to be assured that what you're doing is for the greater good, as well as economically sustainable, I think is going to be a growing driver for you guys. I think I'll skip over that because I'm out of time. So just some conclusions. Food security, insecurity has the potential to increase the disparity between the rich and the poor, which will have a whole range of social issues around the world. Demand for healthy food is likely to be a big driver over coming decades. Increasing climate change is going to be frightening, both in terms of the production side, but also in the demand for the food. And to cope with the climate change, we need to do more about decarbonising. We need to build sustainability. Will palm oil in future generations be seen to be part of the solution or part of the problem by overproducing, leading to all sorts of ill health situations? Or is it producing high-quality food in a highly environmentally responsible way that people see as a valuable thing rather than an unvaluable thing? And I think RSPO has a huge role to play, and congratulations on where you are now. Absolutely congratulations on where you are now. RSPO has a huge role to play in ensuring the sustainability in the strict sense into the future and the trust in palm oil. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.